All right, welcome everybody. I'm glad that we have some folks here. I know it's been a little bit of a long week for many of you, so glad you took the time to come here. You're welcome to come up to the front. Daniela said she'd love to have kind of more of a conversation if you're up for it, but if you want to stay where you are, that's okay too. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Daniela Rosner. She is a professor here in Human-Centered Design and Engineering, and she has been with the department since 2012. Is that right? Yeah, is that right? Ish? 2013, something like that. Yeah. So Danielle and I, I've been telling you little tidbits about each of the faculty I introduced, but Danielle and I, our daughters went to daycare together, which is kind of adorable, and so they become friends over the years. And my favorite memory is that we traveled to the CHI conference together in Scotland. It was 2019, and then we did a stopover in Iceland for 2 days, and we took our daughters around Iceland together, and it was really fun. And I've been collaborating with Daniela as well on a grant. And so really wonderful member of the department, really brings a really unique perspective on research through design, and a really wonderful lens around community-based work and bringing this design sensibility to HCDE. So with that, I'm happy to hand it over to Daniela. Want to clip it to you? Or?
Sure.
Okay.
Hello? Okay, everyone can hear me-ish? Yeah? Or higher?
Yeah.
Hello. Oh, yeah. Or I could just hold it. Oops.
Either way, it's fine.
Too far. Okay. Something. Okay. Hi. Oh, wow. Thank you all for coming. I really thought this week was going to be a two-person show up, so I'm really excited to have so many folks. I am going to work through mostly one project today, but really touching on where I'm trying to go with this work. So it's a little bit of an ambitious talk, where it's going. The toward is a big part of it. I wanted to tell you a little about myself. I'm a weird person. I like to dabble with many things that don't seem to come together, and that includes my training in the arts and in design, and then going into computing and later into fields of science technology studies, HCI, and other kinds of design, kind of artistically oriented design questions. So I do like to knit. It's where it all began, and it will probably come back there again at the end. I have many collaborators in our department, and you might know some of these folks. These are students that advise in the department, some who have just graduated and many on their way this year. And I have a lot of collaborators as well that I'll speak to in this talk, that these are kind of ideas that have been developing particularly with colleagues Aphrodite Pissarra and Gabrielle Ben Abdallah. So this talk kind of centers on this thing here. It's hard to describe what it is. If I told you it was data, what would you say? Could be, right? Could be collecting pollen samples. Maybe it's something even smaller, right? Maybe it's something cellular, and we're kind of looking up close. Another way of describing this is fuzz, right? It's just fuzzy. It's hard to describe. It's full of fluff. And in fact, this is a bud of something I find quite fluffy, which is the dandelion, right? The end of the seed. And in my work, I often start with something very, very particular that also has an abstraction to it. And this is all connected to fiber. So fiber for me offers one really big advantage when we think about fiber, when it comes to anything from computing to other kinds of technoscience developments. Fiber involves our sensorium, right? It really involves touch, feeling, smell, encounters that are just beyond what we can say. We can't always describe with words, right, what we feel. We can't always put into text or or even kind of orient ourselves to discourse, right? So it's beyond that, but it also allows us to think about the things that are absented, in particular, the bodies and labors and knowledges that we hide away or that get explicitly discarded. So I'm not going to kind of get into the theory yet, but I just want to note that what I'm going to talk about today is going to kind of point toward these forms of fiber arts-based inquiry, which at least one person in the audience does a lot of, actually. And it is quite unique for HCDE. So we have a department where Althea here comes from, which is called the Digital DX Arts, which is very particularly oriented towards arts as a way of knowing. But in fact, in our world, in HCDE, the arts are not always so central. So I'm drawing together two kinds of bodies of work, right? So one is critical fiber studies, which is people that are thinking about the textile and the sort of forms of fiber as ways of knowing our world, ourselves, our bodies, our politics, and then also histories of technology and society and science, which are very much tied to questions of how we recognize who's affected and whose labor counts as innovation in these worlds. So in pulling these together, today, I'm going to mostly focus on a project that I've done with some colleagues here. I'll speak to him in a minute, and then kind of point to some future work. And this is involving multiple methods, but I'll just touch on them: archival work, oral histories, and hands-on making. So in the spring of 2014, the Sudanese-Australian author and mechanical engineer Yasmin Abdel-Magid was giving a TED Talk that sort of started with a pretty potent question, which is, someone who looks like me walks past you on the street. Do you think they're a mother, a refugee, victim of oppression, or do you think they're a cardiologist, Bannister, or maybe a local politician? And I did put this together before the election, and this is very prescient today. So what she is speaking to is an idea of bias, right? She's wearing a coral-colored hijab gently draping around her head and neck, which is complementing this long embroidered cloak. And she says, what the world expects of me and the way I'm treated depends on the arrangement of this piece of cloth, right? The cloth itself is a cultural signifier. She says it's about looking beyond your bias. So for her, as for many of us, bias is kind of referring to this habit of mind, right? It's a kind of tendency, if you look it up in Oxford English Dictionary, it would say to favor, dislike a person or thing, especially as a result of a preconceived condition. So it's kind of stereotype, right? Based on characteristics like race, gender, disability. And in the TEDx talk, it's describing to the audience who are in these TEDx spheres. This is one of sort of a techno-optimist space, and there are many folks who are likely white, Judeo-Christian, and seeing this piece of cloth as kind of a negative assumption around this person who was exposing her beliefs. So what she is not mentioning in this talk, though, is that the very arrangement of cloth is not only revealing bias, it is bias, right? So it is a certain kind of bias that is coming out of the textile domain. It's a particular kind of textile grain, which if you think about the threads that traverse the body up and down, there's a slanted angle that a tailor would use and refer to as that sloping, slanting line as bias. So a line running diagonally at an angle is sort of to the warp and weft of woven fabric. So if just taking a look at some examples, these are woven traditions of bias, where the weave is actually quite stretchy. It kind of produces a material affordance of stretch. You can also do weaving with thicker panels, kind of creating a much more paper-like texture, as well as plating bias in the basketry, thinking about the kinds of forms and the age-old techniques that are taken up, including various types of ancestral knowledge drawn into the basketry tradition, and even haute couture, like these kinds of 1930s-esque draped gowns that depend on bias to create the flow of the fabric. So I'm showing you these because bias in this context, in this very different context, is actually pointing to a technique. It's a technique to create something stretchy, something that drapes, or something that is pushing against the grain, that's disrupting, right? That warp and weft, these Euclidean geometries. So it actually makes something new possible, whether it's even a cloth diaper or this fancy gown or the headscarf. Now, this particular talk was happening several years before what has kind of seemed like this clarion call to fix, right, technology bias, algorithmic bias, the kind of harm that we equate with systems that absent or harm. And these efforts are disproportionately affecting lines people across along sort of existing lines of inequity, whether it's race, class, gender, disability, but also it's at the time in 2014, this hasn't actually kind of entered fully the public consciousness of the folks in the TEDx room. So what does seem unique is that the only connection there is if you see textiles as a kind of technological form. Now, these links between fiber and bits have been running deep within kind of histories of computing. As many folks remind, the kind of work of encoding information is age-old, traced to sort of entanglements with string, pre-Columbian quipus as an example of that, which survived Spanish colonization, small knots that are kind of put into these colorful threads and then signifying categories of knowledge. A recent kind of revisiting of this work through the eyes of Chilean artist Constanza Pina Pardo, who visited us actually in 2019 through the Design Trouble exhibit or conference here at UW. Our work is using quipus as a mode of rethinking our engagement with celestial kind of observations, as well as computing itself. So these strands of the quipu, in this case, are also wire. They're not strands of just string, but in fact connected to create an antenna for electromagnetic fields, to amplify them. Now, after thinking through these kind of connections of the early computational pre-Columbian era, many connections have been made to Ada Lovelace's work on sort of thinking through early computing in the sort of legacy of the alliance of a weaving machine and a computer. So she made this explicit quote, this connection in this quote. We may say most aptly that the analytic engine weaves algebraic patterns just as the jacquard loom weaves flowers and leaves. So this explicit connection is really, there's a lot written on sort of whether and how the loom did connect to that analytic engine, this so-called first analytic computer. And yet what we see is that these labors and these industries are, and who they make salient and who they obscure or absent, continue on. So these connected patterns of sort of exploitation in the early decades of the computing industry point to sort of examples like of Navajo women in Shiprock, New Mexico on the left, who are manufacturing chips, and operators on the right who are kind of wiring code that took people to the moon and back, but through the sort of handwork of core memory. And in each case, these stereotypes of sort of nimble fingers and textile propensities were justifying the extraction of labor from these minoritarian workers. Now, fast forward several decades further, and in my early dissertation work, noticed that some of the very first examples of digital life on blogs were run by groups of knitters. And so these kinds of connections of ongoing fabric and fabrication within the digital realm continue. The kinds of ways in which wires are always working as threads and units of digital memory, filling patchwork quilts, or embroidery that encodes sort of the path to the moon and back, we start to think about how computers have grain and pattern and thread count as well. So I'm going to pause for just a moment for those who need maybe like a mental stretch and take you into the classroom with me. So at least one of you were in this class before, but this exercise pulls together some of these lineages into a concrete space of cutting on the bias. So I want you to imagine, this is an exercise developed with Gabriel Ben Abdallah and Aphrodite Pissarra, to think through what it means to create a data set if we take seriously this material form of bias. So we have a piece of fabric before us. Let's say it's this scarf here. And we have some scissors. And now I tell you, take these two things. Create a data set from them by cutting on the bias. What would you do? What question would you ask yourself? Yeah. Could you encode? Great. Yeah, so what is the type of information itself, right? What is that encoding? Is it images? Are you going to cut something, creating maybe like pieces of fabric you could photograph? Yeah.
Maybe I'd actually back up further and ask, what kind of variation can I create by cutting?
Nice. What kinds of variations? So differences. Every cut creates a difference. And that difference is a point of data or information. Okay. Any other thoughts? Yeah.
The first thing I thought about was that because of your scarf example, if I were to cut a diagonal across that as an individual versus I had a few people that were stretching it apart and holding it, and we tried to cut a diagonal, kind of laying out and seeing the differences in the actual outcome and how, some might not be a straight line.
Yeah.
And others, you could get more crisp precision as you're able to stretch it out more and lay it out.
Exactly. So the conditions of the material, as well as my own skill set maybe, or who I'm collaborating with, the setting in which that sort of setup of creating the cuts is happening. Yeah. So all of these things are involved, right, in the production of the data. And they're all choices, right? They're all choices that someone or some people are making, and they are reflecting also the environment, some things that are hard to control. Like I wish I was good at cutting, but maybe I'm a little hard to maybe the tool itself is a little glue stuck, right? It doesn't actually have the edge I need it to. So it reflects back some things that are in our environment, and all of those things are materially embodied, right? So in a sense, what we are starting to see is through a material lens, we're noticing first data is not just found, but made, right? We're creating it, and that our environments and ourselves are part of that process. which is quite different from how we typically think about data. So in this same course, we now 3-4 years later are looking back at some of the early projects that came out from these questions. And I'm just going to highlight 3 quick moments in the class because each one speaks to sort of how these questions can inform how we think through, again, our relationship to data and other forms of computing. So an exercise that came out of this cut was that Catherine Reese, an artist here at UW, decided to record. This was kind of a prompt, actually, to use one's own data. And her data that she created or recorded was a smartphone touches. How many times you just like put your finger on your device across a period of time. So she did a week. And she materialized each touch with pieces of felt that she then laid out, kind of in an information visualization on a board. Different colors here, a little harder to see. And in collecting this, she said, in materializing it, it made me reflect on the movement between the virtual and actual space, noticing differences in my inhabitation of each and the constant of my body presence in both. So she's kind of materializing these device encounters and exploring how the movement and physicality affect how she interprets. And in fact, in each of these touches, you start to see that they play out as a mode of feeling the data, right? Feeling the algorithm somewhat. And the felt is kind of a metaphor in that way. Her kind of response to this was a final assignment to think about the algorithms underlying, right, those touches and the machine learning kind of sort of what was at the time very early generative AI capacities, and took something, this is Catherine Reese's work again, from her, where a region in the Philippines where her family is from. It's a kind of indigenous weaving pattern from Ilocos and Abra region, and turned to the imagery that it created. Looking into the sort of archives of this form of imagery, it's often compared to 1960s op art. If you've seen op art, it has a very similar, right, connection. And yet, in these weaving ontologies, you see that there's a kind of a threatening of the dwindling access to natural resources and scarce documentation of this particular technique. And so she's using AI in this way, not to create the new, but actually in a sense to think with this preservation capacity of the algorithm. So being able to kind of be in dialogue again with the op art tradition, but not to replace. So the Binku imagery was then developed into a short film and animates between. She says, an absence of tangibly made visible through an institutional effort to sustain a dying art. This is, again, a kind of capacity of AI we tend not to amplify as how it can preserve. A final piece from this class, the same class, comes from Shari Glovak-Smith, who is just graduated last year and now is at Santa Cruz as an art professor, looking at, in this case, the capacity for training an AI model on images of braided black hairstyles to produce sort of synthetic but realistic renderings. So they're exploring this variety and angularity of techniques in the resulting compositions, and then noticing how there's sort of unique patterns that emerged. And in this project, they developed an algorithm that treated this braided imagery as text and then mapped each phrase onto a unique hairstyle and used phrases from Audre Lorde's poems to sort of generate them. So they said, in holding space for this dichotomy between modern society's demonization of black hair expression and its simultaneous appropriation of the same expression, they're kind of creating this dialogue between. and reinventing a kind of covert art. So across the sort of braided poetry and Binko patterns and these bias cuts themselves, we're seeing that there's a certain sensibility and sensory apparatus at play. They're complicating the kinds of patterning that comes out of a sort of a typical exposure to algorithms as abstracted or cognitive, and really kind of engaging directly with them, right, to reimagine the sort of modes of material expression possible. In that way, we could think of it as sort of inspiriting or re-embodying the algorithm itself. And in exercises like these, we see a kind of hopeful almost expression that we can be cultivating or conjuring something else from data. And in this kind of orientation to data, you might think of what performance theorist Kemi Adeyemi, who's our colleague here, has called the lean, the sort of expressive capacity to lean past an orthogonal orientation to the world, where who is always lying on the ground and who is standing up straight is sort of dictated by more hegemonic forces. So this sort of good posture or uprightness, but together the lean, that sort of pushing back at 90 degrees, then also engages this notion, right, of the oblique or the bias. It also touches on what two other scholars have thought through as a reading and writing on the bias. So Brodsky takes her text from kind of a sort of feminist orientation to self-expression and auto theory as a way of thinking of writing across the grain, how you can write in a way that sort of pushes back at these orthogonal readings. And Fuentes similarly is thinking about the reading of an archive as something that's elastic and that you can read an archive on the bias in an archive in the same way as a database, right? Thinking about each data part as being something that can be stretched and relieved. So in these kind of moments of skewing and reapplying, we're thinking about these experimental practices that allow for different ways in, different ways of knowing through the angularities of fabric. And in these sort of pedagogical experiments, then there's other ways of sort of bringing a material imagination, right, to the kind of perspectives we have on the sort of data and algorithmic development. So I want to now sort of think a little bit more broadly and kind of orienting to what these bias orientations, but a textile in particular in fiber, can bring to a kind of consideration of our work in HCDE. Sort of three quick points to make. One is just the idea of bringing a materiality to the bias can kind of help us slant or sort of complicate how we imagine algorithmic systems and what they can do. It also draws that attention right to the data itself as being something that isn't just found and identified, but created by us in conditions that we sometimes do and do not have control over. That's an embodied material reality of data. And then third, these kinds of conditionings of whose labor is seen and unseen, and how we can re-establish or undo some of those sort of hierarchies of positioning in terms of especially the sort of gendering and racialization of computing labor that's hidden underneath the surface. So as sort of we follow the thread, literally and figuratively, out of this frame, you can see a lot of the devices in our sort of histories of computing and even in the medical field sort of rely on the technique of bias. In fact, bias threads are in what, on the left, we call core memory, which is one of the earliest forms of information storage that I showed you earlier. And it's the bias thread that allows it to be rewritten, the cores that are kind of each representing a bit on that figure there are rewritten through this diagonal thread. And on the right is the knit occlude device, which is a medical device designed to close a catheter, and if there's a sort of a defect in the heart, these are devices that sort of are drawn to be able to, with a metal called nitinol, and to be pulled in and out at different capacities, or large and small, so that they can fit through without surgery, without invasive surgery, into the area of the heart. And these are just two of many examples, but behind the scenes in each case, right? We see the kinds of labor that are being sort of employed to create the devices themselves are very rarely seen at the consumer level and understood at the level of science and technology sort of innovation work, but in fact appear in marketing brochures and other kinds of, in this case, videos, documenting, in fact, how the propensities of particular people, in this case on the right, for example, the weavers that are Andean weavers that supposedly create and use their own knitting and weaving techniques to do this particular work. In fact, knitting and weaving, as many of us know, are very different. So we've got to think through some of that. So these are the very sort of cool array of particular versions of this device over time, and to trace them is sort of another whole story. But just to note their aesthetic capacity as well is quite interesting to look at. So in the sort of closing of this work, I just want to point to a kind of invitation for you all to think with me in this, and sort of the arts-based inquiry mode, and join a class that will be held in winter that's called Art Worlds of STS, and really does take seriously each of these kind of interrogations of a performance-based work and different formations of textile inquiry as modes of knowledge production in the sciences and in technology fields. So we're going to be exploring these through texts as exhibition catalogs. Looking at here, this is Sarah Rosalina Brady's work, where she takes NASA imagery, reweaves it, and starts to create these colonial kind of reimaginings that she's starting to sort of break open some of the Hubble telescope's history and think through who's controlling the lens, and how is that lens being remade through fiber. A final invitation is to join this Science Technology Studies conference happening in the fall of next year. So this is a conference with both talks like these, but also making and doing exhibitions that will be open for participation, as well as your own, if you're interested, your opportunities to exhibit your work. And this will include a zine festival and all sorts of other activities that in the realm of this sort of theme of reverberations here in Seattle. And the mailing lists I'm just pointing to here are kind of encouragements for you to take a look, including the SSNet, which is the Science Technology Studies mailing list, Minority Performance mailing list, and then our new initiative, Technology and Society. We have a representative in the room. Thanks, Monica. So with that, I would love to thank you all for coming, and I would, take questions if you have any. Thank you.